Welcome to session 4 of our symposium. And in this session, we're going to discuss defense and national security policy and performance. In this session, we have 3 distinguished speakers. I will introduce all 3 speakers and their topics. Our Turkish translator, are you in the Turkish channel or are you in the English channel? Because we can hear your translation. You need to be in the Turkish channel. Thank you. Our first speaker is Dr. Omar Aslan, and he will be speaking about civil military relations in Türkiye under the AK Party. Our second speaker is Dr. Şener Aktürk from Koç University, and he will be speaking to us about defense and national security policies and strategic imperatives under the AK Party rule. And our third speaker is Dr. Özden Zeynep Oktav from Istanbul Medeniyet University, and she will be speaking to us about foreign policy under the AK Party rule, international relations, and great powers. I will introduce each speaker, but we'll also have a discussant whom I will introduce also shortly. Dr. Omar Aslan is an associate professor of international relations at Ankara Yildirim Bayezid University. Is the author of The United States and Military Coup in Turkey and Pakistan, Between Conspiracy and Reality, which was published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2018. His research interests center on comparative civil-military relations, South Asian politics, Turkish foreign policy, terrorism, and political violence. His publications have appeared in Turkish Studies, British Journal of Middle Eastern Studies, Journal of Balkan and Near Eastern Studies, Middle East Critique, Mediterranean Politics, and Oxford Research Encyclopedia of Politics. Our second speaker is Dr. Şener Aktürk. He is a professor in the Department of International Relations at Koç University. He is a scholar of comparative politics with a focus on comparative politics of ethnicity, religion, and nationalism. After completing his bachelor and master's at the University of Chicago and his PhD in political science at the University of California at Berkeley, he was a postdoctoral fellow at Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies and a visiting lecturer at the Department of Government at Harvard University. His book, Regimes of Ethnicity and Nationhood in Germany, Russia, and Turkey, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2012. Which received the 2013 Joseph Redchild Book Prize for the Association for the Study of Nationalities. His articles appeared in many journals such as World Politics, Perspectives on Politics, Comparative Politics, Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies, and so on. He also is the author and editor of several books, as well as the recipient of awards from international institutions. He also received several grants from several institutions from Turkey and abroad. Our third speaker is Özden Zeynep Oktav. She is a professor at Istanbul Medeniyet University. She's also the author of several books, such as Turkey in the 21st Century, Quest for a New Foreign Policy, which was published by Routledge in 2011, Limits of Relations with the West, Turkey, Syria, and Iran, which was published in 2008, and The Changing Dynamics of the Arab Gulf and Saudi Arabia-US-Iran Relations, which also published in 2011. She's the author or the co-editor rather, of the book Violent Non-State Actors and Syrian Civil War, the ISIS and the YPG Cases, which published by Springer in 2018, as well as Dawn of a New GCC Turkey Relations, Dawn of a New Era, published by Cambridge in 2015. She served also as a visiting researcher at Cambridge in the UK and St Andrews University in Scotland. I want to welcome all three of our speakers, but also I want to introduce our discussant who will respond after their presentations, Dr. Ali Ihsan Kahraman. He graduated from Istanbul Bilgi University and the University of London International Program with a Bachelor of Arts in Economics and Management, which was part of the London School of Economics. He established a conceptual theoretical framework for foreign policy in his master's thesis at Sabancı University, which compared Turkey's energy geopolitics at the regional and global levels. His research on China's Lead, Belt and Road Initiative effects on the world political economy earned him a PhD from Istanbul University. He established the Journal of Islamic Politics, a scholarly publication, and he currently focuses his research on the Islamic world, global political economy, international relations theory, and Turkish foreign policy. At Istanbul Medeniyet University, he's been on the faculty of the Department of International Relations. Welcome to all our speakers and respondents. And our first speaker is Dr. Aslan, and you have 25 to 30 minutes.
Professor Sami, thank you. Okay. You can all, I think, hear me. Thank you for inviting me. I think special thanks to SIGA and Sabahat and Zaim University for this opportunity to come back after a few years and present this research on civil-military relations under the AK Party governments. So what I intended to do, since we are talking about Islamic movements here, and the case of Türkiye, I wanted to take this opportunity as to take stock of what has happened in this particular field for now more than 2 decades. So what we have gone through over these 2 decades, and what has been done, what was the purpose, and what is, I think, the ongoing situation. Again, a tentative classification of those little more than maybe 2 decades of civil-military relations in Turkey. I would classify the first period from the beginning of the series of successive, of course, AK Party governments as from 2002 to 2011 as a confrontation phase in which governments, AK Party governments, basically confronted the military, but there was a mutual suspicion in this sense. Of course, knowing from previous experience of the 1990s, and of course earlier, I think AK Party governments knew very well this was a very going into details of the military seeing this to undermine the regime. So they want to do a lot of things to, they went to great lengths in order to undermine the governments. So that's why I call this both covert struggle, in the sense that there was a lot going on behind the curtain, but there was also many things that we actually knew, in the sense that it was this overt struggle between governments and the AK Party governments and the armed forces. I thought 2011, I think, is a good point to stop this, because this was the first time for many, many years, I mean, except just one single small period under Turgut Özal, when the top command, the top general of the armed forces, resigned. But if you leave that episode aside, as the Cold War was ending, then this was the first time in Turkey in 2011 that the top command resigned as they were having disagreements with the government. So instead of trying to undermine the government, instead of trying to do maybe a coup, this was the perception that they actually chose to resign. So this is something that I think we can put as a perhaps, again, arbitrary, but I think as a sort of a critical juncture in which things were turning around and changing, I think. Of course, against the armed forces, the military's interventionist behavior, I think the governments used a few things in order to remain in power, of course, and then keep their power in the face of the military attacks. One, I think I would say, is the US connection. Of course, I mean, Turkey-United States relations, I mean, they were not straightforward. There were a lot of ups and downs and things were going on. I'm aware of those. But in general, there was this, maybe we can call it alignment, in which the US supported AK Party governments in this case. Two, I think, would be improved economy. In terms of economic indicators, the governments were doing very well. So they had huge popular support in I put this there too. So the government enjoyed popular support. This also made it difficult for the army to do more, at least do things more openly maybe. EU membership, of course, basically entrapped the military. The military was, on the one hand, claiming that Turkey wanted to reach this European level of civilization, but at the same time, you cannot really deny EU membership, which requires, of course, limiting the power of the army. So the AK Party governments used this in order to basically entrap the military in this sense, which was successful. And then the fifth one, perhaps shaming. The shaming, of course, came through these court trials. The government used whatever media power it had and the power in the judiciary to a certain extent to basically shame the military into I mean, a bit of a silence in that sense. But objective, of course, over those years until 2011, I think, was always democratic control of armed forces. So this is the European, of course, the expression that government did a lot of reforms to curb the political influence of the armed forces. The aim, again, was also to create a professional military. And I will talk about what I mean by professional military when I come to a couple of slides later into this classification of certain armies. So professional army, of course, without a big political role, a professional army that does basically or tries to do what the government intends to do, so becomes an instrument of policy, but of course contributes within the remit of, I think, their expertise to policy making in terms of defense, in terms of when there is a war, terrorism. So in their areas of expertise, that means, of course. And 2011, of course, then we have the top command resigning. So that's where I chose to end this confrontation phase. And then we have from 2011, I think, to coup attempt, the failed coup attempt in 2016, something like a consolidation phase. The government now becomes clearly, I think, in control, meaning, of course, you could ask me, if there was control, how come the coup happened and took place? But in the sense of curbing this otherwise stronger military in the sense of a wider political influence, the government succeeded in this task, in this mission. And there were mass verdicts in this period at this Balyoz trial, in these, again, these court trials. Again, I know that a couple of years later, these trials were now, let's say, I mean, people, again, I mean, it emerged that these trials too had certain deficiencies in terms of how they were opened, how they were prosecuted. But we must also, I think about the military silence. Now, many scholars are writing about this. Especially in Turkey, this has been a relatively under-researched topic, how the military behaves when there is a civilian unrest in the country. And in this case, in the case of Gezi protests, for instance, we have very much a quiet military, so they did not try to use this, exploit the situation. that also shows us, I think, not only that they maybe did not want to, but also they could not. They were not able to use this, exploit this in this sense. The reforms continued, and I think the government felt a bit more secure in terms of at least the military. And I know, of course, 2013, there was an upheaval in terms of this political, like a police conspiracy, basically pretending under or behind a like trial, behind a corruption investigation against the government. I know that there was an unrest still in this period, but in terms of military-civilian relations, the government seemed in control, I think, in this period more than the previous one. And we have a lot of changes after coup attempt, and I put them all together. I know that some of these came after the 2018, the presidential elections. Some of them came right after the coup attempt. But overall, I mean, we have a significant array of steps taken by the government actually to really this time control the government. Not even control, but even, I think, transform the way that the civilians and the military interact from now on. So bring about more permanent structural change to this. Again, some of these things, I don't want to go into details of them, but again, I mean, military high schools were shut down. All war colleges and institutes now came down under this new university, National Defense University. The gendarmerie as the most important, I think, actor that resisted the coup and were successful and were key, I think, in defeating the coup attempt in 2016. So they came under the Interior Ministry now. A new Gendarmerie and Coast Guard Academy was established in Ankara. And then as of 22 November 2022 of last year, we have the official figures of how many people were purged from the military. And you have the numbers there. I mean, considerable number of people at the level of generals and officers and non-commissioned officers, NCOs, were purged from the military. And then a former Chief of General Staff, Hulusi Akar, became the National Defense Minister. And then Chief of General Staff became eventually responsible to Defense Ministry. But I mean, all of these moves were done. Again, I mean, this part, just to enumerate them. And we know, I guess we can say that now, looking back to the first period of confrontation, and then looking back to this consolidation phase, what was done in this period, in the final period, has been, of course, huge in this sense. Recently, military courts eliminated, martial law is eliminated too. So Supreme Military Council decides every year, annually, who is going to be promoted and who is going to be demoted. Now, it also has been changed to basically allow more civilian weight in this. And now President can give direct orders to commanders. So the General Staff Command, Genelkurmay Başkanlığı in Turkish, so their role has been reduced in this sense, in terms of both, I think, demotions and promotions, but also in terms of giving orders to commanders on the field. So this is more like not exactly the same, but I think it kind of mimics the American kind of model, in which the president, the executive, can reach out to field commanders, bypassing the intermediary superiors of theirs otherwise. So intelligence also is now allowed to collect intelligence inside the armed forces. And then there is no longer a tenure limit for the Chief of General Staff, because it was 4 years before. Some of these I mentioned for a particular reason. I will touch on some of them, especially, I mean, if you think about this tenure limit, because I think that there is a new, so the government recently did something new there. We should, I think, remember that there was this change, which was, I think, important. So significant transformation in the way that the military and civilians basically react after the 2016 failed coup attempt. I mean, other classifications are possible, but I have 4 here. And professional armies is the one that we always hear about. Army professionalism, meaning that no political role. Ideally, of course, there is much written about this recently. But professional armies are those that have no political role. Again, it's controversial, I know. Depends on what you define, how you define political here. But in the sense of intruding into, I mean, beyond their areas of expertise, intruding into political affairs, and they're supposed to also be distant from society in the sense that they are, I mean, they don't easily adopt the societal values, and they are not easily influenced by societal, let's say, waves in the society, whether these are ideological waves to some extent, or unrest in the society. So there is a clear separation between army and society in the professional armies. But I know that professional armies also commit coups. So professionalism does not really make armies really democratic in the sense. I'm pretty much aware of this. The second type, like earlier Turkey, if we think about Turkey in 1990s, before in earlier decades, popular Praetorian army, in the sense that this army has a political role. It sees in itself a political role, guardian of the regime. So clearly, and highly popular too. So there's a reason why we call them popular. But at the same time, they don't have a desire to stay in power, and that makes them different from predatory Praetorian armies, which is, I think, today Egypt, for instance. Big difference in the sense that in the third one, predatory Praetorian armies, they want to stay in power, and their influence becomes much more permanent, much more visible, I think. They also become much more suppressive. They also are more violent when they are in power, when they grab power. So we can differentiate them from popular Praetorians in this case. And the fourth one is nation's army. So nation's army is, I think, direct opposite to professional armies. In the nation's army, like in China, I think in Russia, there's an organic unity between society and the military. Military more and more reflects societal values. And political actors too now intrude into military affairs. So political actors without much military knowledge, military expertise, defense expertise necessarily, they try to shape, inside the military, but also try to determine what is normally within the military area of expertise. So there is much more intrusion from the political side, but also army officers, we see them more and more in civilian jobs. So they become ministers, they are appointed as governors if you have them in your country, or ambassadors and so on. So more and more army people, retired army people too, they are given those jobs in a nation's army. But I mean, to some extent, this has been mentioned. So my, again, with a question mark, of course, I mean, the government, AK Party governments began with the objective of establishing, I think, a professional army. And especially, of course, even, I mean, more assuredly, we can say that they wanted to establish a democratic control of armed forces. But what we are going towards more and more looks like we want to have a nation's army. But I will quickly qualify this statement, because I mean, this is, I think, very early to say this. And I have a couple of things that I will, suggest to qualify this statement. But more and more, when I look at the speeches of President Erdogan and the government, ministers, the cabinet members, high-level people within the government and within the political party, AK Party, more and more, this has been mentioned, I think, in the earlier in this morning session too. But after 2018, of course, we have, I think, a new discourse in which a discourse that sees actors and forces and events more like in black and white, and all actors, including the military too, are forced basically to take a stand, in these political debates. And that hurts civil-military relations, I think. If our benchmark is democratic control of armed forces, previously, of course, before 2002, one of the major complaints about civil-military relations in Turkey was that the parliament does have no control over armed forces. So whenever budget comes in, whenever things about the military come into the parliament, they used to be rubber stamped without any question, without an investigation. The army was also accused of being unaccountable. We don't see a development here, I think. We have a similar situation now, I think, after for the last 5 years. So the armed forces also now are seen as pretty much immune to criticism, and criticizing them or questioning them or asking questions and investigating them is again seen as something like a sin. And then that hurts, I think, civil-military relations in this case. And more, of course, we are seeing something like an, I mean, this is, of course, a wider debate, but since populism takes hold, I think political party, nation, state, and then the military too, I think recently, are seen as almost like equal. So it's difficult to distinguish them from each other. And these are some of the quotations that, President Erdogan recently said, and that those tell me a bit, again, these are very early statements, very early indicators that we may be headed in a certain direction, but more and more like there is a political project for the army too, and that will, if it continues, turn or may, let's say, turn the army into a extension of the government, which will eventually again hurt civil-military relations in this case. Similar to parliament having no control over the military, we have an awkward situation, I think, with the defense ministry too, in the sense that, again, earlier, pre-2002 period, one of the problems that people always talked about and scholars always wrote about was this. The defense ministry is basically run by, again, there had been, of course, many civilian defense ministers too, but they were very weak. So the military basically used to control the defense ministry to a large extent. So defense ministry did not really have any kind of a, could not scrutinize the army. This is about procurement, of course, getting military weapons from the outside, whether it is about the direction of the military. So this was in the past, but today too, we have a awkward situation in the sense that we have a former chief of general staff, Hulusi Akar, is the defense minister. So we don't still have this full civilianized defense ministry. So we have not really achieved something there in the sense. And again, what we know from at least the media and so on is that, the defense minister still wants to run the ministry as like a, barracks. He wants to run like a pasha in the army. It's not like a really civilian in this case. And also more recently, there's much more meaning, I think, attributed to this, the title of the president, commander-in-chief. And that shows us how enthusiastic the government has become to basically to show up in military uniforms and to be close to the military in this sense. So that also is I think, newish development in that aspect. And the final point about this tenure of the Chief of General Staff, I wanted to mention, this is again something that I wanted to bring to your attention. The age limit for generals, I think, to be appointed in Turkey is 67. But recently, the Chief of General Staff, Yaşar Güler, he basically completed his term and he was supposed to retire. But the government, I think, wanted him to remain. But so the age limit was basically extended 1 year by the government decree, which I think had never been done in Turkey. So this is very new, which is, again, studying these things comparatively. This we know from Pakistan, for instance, all the time. Like in Pakistan, if the government is weak or if the military is strong, if the military wants to stay, or if the government is kind of close to a particular general that they want him to stay, then they do these things. But any extension as such is not good in terms of, again, this democratic idea of like civil-military relations. And I think Yaşar Güler will be, after Kenan Evren, he will be the longest serving Chief of General Staff by this extension. So this is very new, and I found this odd and wanted to bring this to your attention, because this is, again, something very much, I don't know why they did it. I don't know how that it came up, but it was done for the first time, I think. But So qualifiers. I will begin with those with a tick on their side. Well, first of all, we don't have military officers being given civilian positions, which is, I think, good. So we don't have the, I talked about this nation's army, and I wanted to put a question mark to my expression towards the nation's army. One reason why I think we may not be headed in this direction is this military officers still aren't given any civilian positions. Because if we, we may discuss if we can compare, government in Turkey to, like Chavez and Bolsonaro and other populist governments, like in Tunisia, I think too, President Said there, I think, has been doing certain things. But unlike those countries, internal security is never left to the military here. We still have a very strong police. Whenever there is a protest or a COVID situation, something, or earthquake response, on those emergency cases, we don't resort to military, which is good, because whenever you resort to military in terms of internal security, it complicates things. We don't have this too. But there's a constant pressure, I think, on the military. If you remember, this hasn't been done perhaps in 2022, but in 2020, 1921, somehow without much, I think, ground, there was always these coup rumors, and the government was always talking about, the opposition did something, maybe they want a coup, there is a coup likelihood, like a chance. So this was always like this keep the, this pressure point on the military. That continues. With the awkward situation that I want again to bring to your attention is these coup trials. This is something that I want to work on in the coming days and weeks. But if you compare failed coup trials in different countries in the past, usually we don't, not usually, but I think I have never come across a coup trial that long. I know that this is a particular coup. It's a unique one because it's not just the military, but it's a larger network of people, which again, you never know perhaps how deep it goes, how wide the net is. But all the coups that I can think of right now and all the ones that actually failed, the trials usually trials of the military people happen quickly, and people want to forget about this coup, not in the sense of not taking precautions, but in the sense of getting rid of this trauma a bit. But in Turkey, these trials go on and on and on. Still, I think we hear regularly, some people within the military are now detained and they are arrested. It just goes on. I think this pressure point too, trials, still can go on. In my interviews with army people, they would tell me, Hocam, how can you be on active duty if there is this constant threat that someday you can actually, some morning, you can be detained and you can end up in prison. So there is that pressure point that I think is definitely there. Another, I think, important feature that we see for the last few years, there's an extra trust in the gendarmerie, I think. I have checked President Erdogan's speeches during this earthquake response. Most of the time when he talks about the army, he talks about the gendarmerie. Because I think gendarmerie is under the interior ministry and is seen closer to the government, and there is more trust and confidence to it. And I think they are also quicker and easier to get shaped by the government, to get influenced by the government in this sense too. And just I found this interesting. Just like what I put there in terms of disaster relief, poverty reduction or elimination, national development, or even think about the pandemic times. Tunisia used the military in order to put these shutdown measures and then maybe distribute vaccines. Bolsonaro did. Chavez used to do. Chavez used military when he was doing flood relief in 1999. So in those countries, the military, when you have an emergency situation, the military is the one that immediately comes to mind. But here it doesn't come to mind. And that shows me there is, I think, in terms of the government-military relations, despite all that I said, there is extra still gap. There is a lack of confidence towards the military still. So the government is not really comfortable I mean, with using the military in those circumstances. And I think earthquake, to me, is a very good indicator of this. I mean, because you could have easily used them. Right? So just the fact that it doesn't come to mind, or if it does, then you don't trust them that much. That shows us that still there is a, large, road to be taken towards its full confidence in the military. And this is something, again, I think to think about. Finally, I'm finishing. Since, again, I said, we are, this is about Islamic movements, but now we are talking about the case of Turkey. One implication of, I think, our experience in Turkey, here with the military is Islamic movements and army relations. Like, what do they want to do with the army? When in opposition and when they come to, I think, power. Is that relationship still always antagonistic, like hostile relations? Or when they come to power, what do they do with the army? And what do they want to do with the army? That, I think, is a research that should be done comparatively, because we have many Islamic movements in different countries, from Muslim Brotherhood to Jamaat Islami in Pakistan, and many others in others too. So we know that at certain points there are episodes in which, I think, Islamic movements were okay with coups. They supported military, intervention, but they also supported. So in their ideas, what do you want? How do you conceptualize the army? We, I think, are going through that confusion too a little bit these days. But more needs to be seen, I think. We just are in the earlier stages of this. I'm thinking about the police relations with the government, and then comparing this to the army relations with the government. With the police, of course, you feel much more confident, because it's difficult to replace an army too, because it requires much more expertise, takes longer time. Army is much larger. So that's, I think, maybe one of the reasons why the government does not really feel confident with the armed forces yet. And I know that despite all this, defense industry is improving and so on. There are huge developments on this score. Maybe in the Q&A we can touch up on this. Okay, thank you. That's it.
Thank you very much, Dr. Aslan, for this really very enlightening presentation on the status of the civil-military relations during the AK Party rule. Dr. Aslan started by talking that there are different phases, and he talked about 3 phases in that relationship. The first one was between 2002 2011, what he called the confrontation phase of the AK Party Armed Forces relationship. He said there was a lot of suspicion between both sides, and the government tried to use several tactics against the armed forces. What he called the U.S. connection, the improved economy, which brought it popular support, the ascension to the EU membership, which curbed, or he said it entrapped the military, and shaming them through criminal court cases like the Erdogan crime. And he said there were reforms to curb the power of the military, the original idea was to turn it into a professional military, to make it more into a personnel of expertise in the military fashion to protect the borders. And that led, of course, at one point to resignation by the top commander, which is unprecedented. The second phase was between 2011 2016, which he termed consolidation phase, where there were more freedom in the appointments and promotion and detention, as well as it was characterized by mass verdicts in the Belarus trial. He also noted that during that period, the military was quiet during the civil unrest, particularly during the Gezi protests in 2013. The third phase is the post-2016 phase, where there were significant changes, some may call them reforms, the establishment also of new National Defense University, the abolition of, or the shutting down of the high school the military high schools, and the establishment of the Gendarmerie and Coast Guard schools. He said there are new figures now that tell us how many military personnel were purged from the military during this time up to November 2021, I believe. Over 24,000 were purged, including 150 generals and over 10,000 officers, which led to significant transformation. Now the president can give direct orders, bypassing the chief of the general staff. That there has been, they eliminated the use of martial law and military courts. There is no tenure now for the chief of the general staff, and that intelligence can actually be collected inside the armed forces. But that intelligence collected by outside, is it military intelligence or MIT? MIT. He also talked about 4 types of armies: professional army, which would have no political role; popular Unitarian, which will have a political role but no desire to stay in power with popular support. And the example here is Turkey in the early 90s. Of course, the first one is what could be looked at in many democratic oriented countries. The third is predatory, Praetorian, like Egypt, where the army wants a political role, wants to control political life. And the fourth is what he called nations armies, like China and Russia, where there is an organized, an organic unity between the army and society, where the political actors intrude into the military and where army officers have civilian jobs. He noted that there is a tendency, still anecdotal evidence, that there is a tendency to turn the military in Turkey, so this needs further research, into becoming more or less a nation's army after 2018. He gave 2 pieces of evidence from speeches that were given in 2020 and 2022 during the NDU, the National Defense University graduation speech, and another speech in 2020, where it was said that army and nation are inseparable. And he said this is a step, in his opinion, backward in the civil-military relations, because the notion here is that the nation equals the state, equals the party, equals the military. This approach will turn army into an extension of the government, which hurts the civil-military relations. And he also noted several other negative points in his view about this, including that a former chief of the general staff would be defense minister, not an actual civilian. And this will make him immune to criticism, meaning and the meaning of the commander-in-chief also, and the extending of the tenure. And he gave the example of the current chief of the general staff, General Yashar Guler, with the extension of his age, which makes him the longest serving. He talked also, he said, but not so fast. There are some qualifiers, but this is not a final conclusion. There is no military officers given position jobs like in this type of a construction. That the internal security is not left to the military, that there is still strong police, and there is still, and he also noted that the coup trials have been going on now for years, which is very long when compared to other, even though granted that there were civilian elements within that coup. And he said that gives a little bit of apprehension among officers for the fear that they could get arrested. So there's also an extra trust with the gendarmerie. He said there are some implication, and he posed a final question in his speech about the relationship between Islamic movements and army or military relations. He said that question has not been definitively answered. Still, there are discussions on both sides. Some movements prefer coups, some movements call for freedom and democracy, that question needs to be further investigated. Thank you, Dr. Aslan. Now we turn to Dr. Akhtar.
Thank you very much, Professor Sami Al-Aryan, and to the Center for Islam and Global Affairs at Sabahattin Zaim University for giving me the opportunity to present on the defense and national security policies and strategic imperatives under AK Party governments, which will be a summation, kind of a grand summary of sorts of the last 20, even 30 years. I'm going to start my PowerPoint presentation with references to a number of background articles from which you can follow up the stage of the argument that I'm pursuing. So in that sense, the presentation today is the viewing together of numerous articles I have published, at least since 2006, that you will see up in the broadcast. Just in a couple of minutes, I'll go in that order. Yes, thank you very much. So first, I want to briefly talk about the kind of background to the rise of Turkey, that one might, thank you very much. The rise of Türkiye as, could we use this? No? Okay, thank you. And that goes back actually to the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And this might sound cliche, because you probably have heard that the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, has been such a watershed for this and that country. And it is true that, I suppose, from Chile to Algeria, from Southeast Asia to even the Caribbean, the dissolution of the Soviet Union may have been a watershed event of sorts. But in the Turkish case, this is particularly true. And we are really talking about the disappearance of the largest military political threat of the last 300 years, right? For as long as it existed, Imperial Russia in the 18th, especially 19th century, and the Soviet Union in the 20th century was the largest and most immediate military threat to Turkey, because it was right across the border, unlike most other countries that are affected, let's say, by communist movements, let's say in Latin America or North Africa or Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia. In the case of Türkiye, Imperial Russia and then Soviet Union was the largest military political threat. I mean, for this audience, especially in Istanbul and Turkey, it might not need that much emphasis, but I still would like to emphasize for our international audience that the largest, military battles that the Ottoman Empire lost were against Imperial Russia. The War of 1774-1783 that resulted with the loss of Crimea, the first Muslim majority territory to be occupied by Russia from Ottoman lands, and then the other wars, War of 1821-29, where the Russian militaries came to Edirne and secured the independence of Greece, and then Bulgaria, Romania, Montenegro, Serbia, every single Balkan Christian nation state got its independence thanks to Russian military victory, not to indigenous military rebellion. So, and in the First World War II, just before the Bolshevik Revolution, Russian military actually moved very deep into East Anatolia and the Black Sea region. All the Black Sea coast, including Trabzon up to Trebolu, were under Russian occupation. And so was Eastern Anatolia, Erzurum, Erzincan, down to Muş and Bitlis, if you know Anatolian geography, were already under Imperial Russian invasion. Why is this important? Because it's only the diminishing of Soviet-Russian threat that opened the opportunity space for Turkey to pursue a more comfortable, self-confident foreign policy to project power regionally and sometimes even beyond its region. As long as there was a gigantic Soviet-Russian military right across Kars and Ardahan in present-day Georgia and Armenia, Turkish military and political decision makers, policymakers, could not concentrate on anything else unless they first considered the possibility, the risk of Russian invasion any day of the year. Now, I traveled this morning from our beautiful campus in Rumeli Feneri overlooking the Black Sea, and every morning when I wake up and look into the sea, right, if it was an open sky and if we had better eyesight, we could have seen Odessa and the Crimea, you know, Akyar in Crimean Tatar, Sevastopol in Russian. And in fact, that would be where the Russian amphibious landing and the naval bombardment would begin, right, on the northern coast of Istanbul. And this is not some sort of paranoia because it happened so many times in Ottoman history. So I think I emphasized this enough. This was the starting point of this publication, Turkish-Russian Relations After the Cold War, 1992-2002, which I published in 2006, which basically argued that the reason why what surprises many Western and non-Western observers, the rise in Russian-Turkish cooperation, is only explicable if we understand first the existence of Georgia as an independent nation state, as a buffer state between Turkey and Russia, which it did not exist for hundreds of years, and Armenia and Azerbaijan. So the existence of this Caucasian buffer, plus until at least 2014, the existence of a relatively robust Ukraine that had Crimea, which basically made Russia as a secondary power in the Black Sea. That's until the, of course, occupation and annexation of Crimea, basically gave a free hand to Turkey, both in naval and in terms of risks that emanate from the land. Which also means that if this threat reemerges anytime, not only that Russian-Turkish relations would go back where they were in the previous 300 years, but entire Turkish grand strategy would have to be retooled again. Luckily for us, and I think for much of the world, it's unlikely to go back because Russia is a stably declining geopolitical force in the world in terms of its demography, economy, politics, and every indicator of power. So it's a receding great power. It's unlikely to fully reoccupy Georgia, Azerbaijan, and or Armenia. And even the result of the ongoing Ukrainian invasion is, as you know, uncertain and has been not what the Russian planners hoped. Now, I'm not going to spend this much time on every article and every argument, as this was the opening PowerPoint slide, but I want to mention that going back to 2000, and that is before the AK Party, that's why I want to mention this, that there is a structural fear of rising Turkish power. This article that I cited here, and also in the final article I'll show, published by Michael Robert Hitchcock in the American Military Armed Forces magazine. Parameters is not just any journal, it is the journal of US Armed Forces. It was published in 2000, Hegemon Rising, the mismatch between Turkish military modernization and foreign policy objectives. So already at least 2 years before, and given how long it takes for some articles to get published, it must have been some years before, already years before AK Party came to power, some American military planners, such as Hitchcock and the Parameters, feared about Turkey as a hegemon rising in the Middle East that could turn into a threat to American interests. Now, I evaluate this thesis a little bit in the final publication I'm going to show. It's an exaggerated threat. I don't think any regional power has the capacity to become a regional hegemon in the Middle East because of the roughly, matching countervailing potential of Turkey, Iran, Israel, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, each with either economic or demographic population or military, including nuclear powers. If any one of these five powers, Turkey, Iran, Israel, Egypt, or Saudi Arabia, sought to actually dominate the Middle East as a hegemon, I think 2-3 others would be more than sufficient to make that impossible. So it's just strange for me that strange is the shortest version, that some strategic planners in the US really feared Turkey as a hegemon rising, because there are so many powers in the region that they shouldn't have feared. The other regional players could easily balance it. But the point here is that there was this fear, especially with Turkish-Russian rapprochement, happening already in 1999, 2000, 2001. So this is the structural element to it. The fear of Turkey rising after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, this is a structural feature independent of which political party is in power in Turkey, I think. So I highly doubt that it's going to go away, let's say, with a government change or anything else. But there is a domestic, of course, origin to the rise and, rise, fall, and I guess revival of Turkish power over 3 decades. And the second element, yes, okay. And the domestic origin I want to point out, which I discussed in another article, Turkey's civil rights movement and the reactionary coup, segregation, emancipation, and the Western reaction. This was the special issue of Inside Turkey on the failed military coup, actually. It's fairly detailed, and there I emphasize what started out as a civil rights movement. That's, of course, how I describe it, maybe coming from a somewhat American, framing of what has happened. What AK Party in its election and party manifesto labeled as the silent revolution. The silent revolution, so-called silent revolution, or I said civil rights movement, was the removal of de facto and some of them de jure segregation and second-class citizenship of religious conservatives and ethnic minorities in Turkey. That scarf ban is the most known one of these, but it's definitely not limited to that. I mean, the article is very detailed, and these articles are all freely available online. If you just Google them, you should be able to download them through either the journal's website or other free depositories online, and so on and so forth. And there I go through all kinds of different indicators through which we can clearly see that at least until 2010s, the religious conservative majority almost of the population was more or less segregated from the highest echelons of what I call the unelected components of government, the judiciary, the military, high bureaucracy, right? So these are kind of the 3 legs of any government that are appointed. So almost all of which centered on presidential appointments with a presidency that was unelected itself, because Turkey, as you know, in any parliamentary government had indirect selection of presidential candidates, at least until 2014. So these and the prohibition on Kurdish and other indigenous ethnic minority languages that was at one point so strict that, a former minister in the cabinet, the late Şerafettin Elçi, went to jail during the military junta, the military dictatorship of 1983, for claiming that he is a Kurd and that there are Kurds in Turkey. From that point, come to 2004, 2009, when the Turkish state established a Kurdish TV channel, a publicly funded 24-hour Kurdish TV channel, combined with Arabic, Zaza, Bosniak, Circassian broadcasting. And in 2011, public schools had as elective courses these indigenous minority languages, Arabic, Kurdish, Zaza, Circassian, Bosniak, Laz, and Georgian. Since the removal of segregation measures on Muslim conservatives is much better known, we know that people wearing headscarves, for example, entered the parliament in October 2013, and then as officers in the military, judiciary, step by step in the following years. So why did all of this matter? Because it was, as I said in the manifesto, was seen as a silent revolution or civil rights movement, and that endowed Turkey with some kind of, Türkiye of the time, with some kind of democratic, self-confidence and bravado as a model of peaceful democratization in the Muslim majority world, right? Because this wasn't achieved with, although it's called silent revolution, it wasn't revolutionary, right? It's a completely non-violent process that occurred more or less through civil society and competitive multi-party elections. So, for example, unlike what people would point out to the Iranian revolution or any other radical, regime changes in other parts of the Muslim majority world. And at this time, this Turkish civil rights movement was seen initially as paralleling Turkey's, for example, effort to join the European Union, because this was a time that through these momentous reforms, with a politically and economically dynamic kind of state and society, Türkiye was a likely candidate for membership to the European Union. However, here we have two critical junctures. The first one is in the slide and the other one is in the next one. European Union, despite this, at that time, phenomenal economic growth and democratic reforms, rebuffed Turkey. This could be one of the, switches in the railroad, right? Turkey could have been admitted to the European Union. It certainly had an economy that, for many of us, seemed at least as dynamic, actually more than Bulgaria and Romania, which were admitted, and a democracy that is much older than the Bulgarian and Romanian democracy and much more continuous, going back to the Ottoman constitutional reform revolution and all the way to 1925 and then 1950. I mean, 1920, 25, 1950. And yet, as many of you very well know, Turkey's negotiations were suspended and frozen on the face of it by the Greek Cypriot veto, but actually by the French opposition and some other key EU member states opposition in 2005. This combined with, for example, European Court of Human Rights' approval of the headscarf ban in the Leyla Şahin versus Turkey case, which again gave the impression to the religious conservatives, but I think also to the AK Party leadership, that the kind of Muslim majority democracy with public visibility of expressions of Islam might not be tolerated or welcomed by the European policymakers. So here is a shift. European powers very uneasy about Muslim majority democracy and public expressions of Islam that rebuffed Turkey, and that brings me to probably the one article I want to mention the most in this connection, my article on Turkey's role in the Arab Spring and the Syrian conflict, because Turkey's geopolitical identity, as I just summarized, has been in flux since the end of the Cold War, since the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And although there were societal pressures for democratization initially motivated popular support for European integration, these appear to be, with the suspension of the membership negotiations, the European Court of Human Rights judgments, etc., incompatible identity narratives between EU and Turkey, and rising Islamophobia, especially in Western Europe, made such integration increasingly difficult. And then the next, arguably more critical turning point occurred. Turkey's vocal support for democratization, for majority rule, in the context of the Arab revolutions, Arab Spring, brought these contradictions between European and Turkish, Western European and Turkish policymakers to the fore. The coup in Egypt in July 2013 was a turning point, with Turkey and key Western powers adopting sharply different positions, Turkey being the most prominent opponent of the coup for many, many years, whereas France, eventually United States and others embracing the Sisi regime shortly after 2013. So this showed that Turkey will continue to support a majority rule, which is a sine qua non, a minimum of democracy is not only majority rule, but it's at least majority rule. So Turkey continued to support majority rule in Egypt, in Syria, the two critical battlefields in a way, but also in other critical countries affected by the Arab revolutions, Arab Spring. The PKK's offensive in July 2015, which has been the biggest, wave of including suicide terrorist attacks across Turkey in the last 20 years, in starting in July 2015, and the failed coup attempt just a year later in July 2016 elevated Turkey's immediate internal security threats above all considerations. And this was one reason for, in a way, Turkey's what I call the revolutionary position in support of the Arab Revolution Spring, which we could clearly observe in 2012, 11, all the way up to 2013, 14, 15, kind of came to a structural limit again, hit the wall because of these internal security threats in particular. And Turkey had a limited rapprochement with Russia, which is a key counter-revolutionary, of course, state when it comes to suppressing the Arab revolutions. It's not the only great power that favored suppressing the Arab Spring. Iran is there, US to a certain extent, France and others, but Russia more prominent than others, especially in the Syrian theater, of course. So this brought us, this is kind of a centerpiece of the presentation, and therefore this article is, we see here the peak of what I call the revolutionary position in Turkish foreign policy and grand strategy, and then it kind of starts declining from that point onwards. And this is not atypical at all in revolutionary cycles in world history. From the French Revolution to the Soviet to the Iranian, these are very different ideologies, extremely different. And yet any kind of major wave of revolutions or major democratization in a significant polity often leads to this kind of self-confidence and the urge to kind of project the new vision, in the case of Turkey, Muslim majority democracy vision, to the rest of the world. And this is a good point to introduce the third article in line. As I've said, all of these are already published and freely publicly available articles in English. Turkish grand strategy as the third power, a realist reassessment. Here, what we see, foreign policy thinking and grand strategic imperatives are almost always straddling this dilemma between material capabilities from a realist point of view and some idealistic, ideological, and other objectives, right? And in the story that I brought all the way up to 2016, 2017 so far, we can see this in the Turkish case as well. The role of being kind of the leader, the flag carrier of Arab Spring and democratization in the Muslim world reached a certain limit due to the economic, military, and other demographic, etc., capabilities of Turkey. However, I want to emphasize, as I did in this article in particular on Turkey's grand strategy, that Turkey's immediate neighbors cannot pose an existential, conventional threat to Türkiye. Syria or Iraq, Armenia or Georgia, Azerbaijan or Bulgaria or Greece cannot pose an existential, conventional threat to Turkey, with the partial exception of Iran. But neighbors of neighbors, which include former superpowers such as Russia, but also nuclear armed and quite powerful Israel, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Italy over the basically less than 700 kilometers to the west, are indeed equal or superior to Turkey in terms of either their economic, military, or demographic capabilities. So unlike, for example, what people have observed about Israeli grand strategy, which is known as the periphery doctrine in its first decades, associated with the first Israeli prime minister. What was the periphery doctrine? Israel's most important immediate threats, enemies, are its Arab neighbors, right? Israel is a new Jewish state in the middle of an Arab sea, so it should ally with the non-Arab neighbors of neighbors, Ethiopia, Iran, Turkey, whatever. Turkey's geopolitical situation is almost exactly the opposite. None of its neighbors have the capability, and in many cases, not the will, but will can change. That's realism, right? Intentions can change. But in a way, Turkey lives, if we just consider its immediate neighbors, with neighbors that it can live with easily, as long as those neighbors are not occupied by great powers. And that's exactly what happened after the Cold War, right? 4 of 8 of Turkey's neighbors have been immediately occupied, not immediately, I mean, they were directly occupied, not through proxies, by Russian, American, and in the case of Iraq, American and British forces. So this is the balance of power between Turkey and its neighbors. When you look at GDP, both in terms of real dollar terms of, or purchasing power parity, or population, or defense budget, or military power index ranking, Turkey is quite unrivaled compared to its neighbors, Greece, Bulgaria, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, maybe Iran. It's about half the GDP, same population, 3/4 Turkey's defense budget, and somewhat close to Turkey in military ranking, with nuclear power plant, which is an added kind of capacity for Iran that Turkey doesn't have. But leaving aside, in part, Iran, none of Turkey's neighbors could pose this conventional threat. Therefore, actually, Turkey has the freedom or comfort zone to conduct a somewhat ambitious foreign policy and grand strategy, unless there are military occupations of other great powers in its immediate neighborhood, which of course exists with the Russian military in Syria, American military until recently in Iraq. Again, Russian occupation in parts of Georgia, South Ossetia, Abkhazia, and in Crimea, and in now parts of Kherson, Zaporizhia, Eastern Ukraine. So in a way, the goal there would be, I mean, what is both in Turkey's interest and what I also normatively advocate and still advocate is the end of these foreign occupations, primarily Russian and Iranian in the case of Syria, Russian in the case of Ukraine, Georgia, until very recently American in the case of Iraq. And when you look at, again, the ups and downs of Turkish-American and Turkish-Russian relations, at the same time, you see that Turkish-Russian relations were coziest at the time of the Iraq invasion, when the chief of Turkey's National Security Council, Tuncer Kılınç, said in March 2003 that Turkey should abandon its Western vocation and ally with Russia and Iran. And he was, you know, 4-star general and chief of National Security Council. It's unsurprising that it was, March 2002, just the run-up to the Iraq invasion, when Turkey, having been relieved by the disappearance of the Russian military some 10 years ago, now faced the impending invasion, a very destabilizing, as we now know, a horrendous invasion by the American military in Iraq. Yes, and which brings me to an example that combines all of these threads, and that I'm going to conclude in the concluding slide. And that's a very short piece, again, publicly available. Turkey's Operation Peace Spring and the Battle for Free Syria. Of course, Operation Peace Spring is just one of a series of operations that Turkey conducted together with the Free Syrian Army, now Syrian National Army, back in 2019. Here, what we see, maybe it wasn't emphasized enough in the previous slide and the article, is that Turkey is the reason I called it Turkey as a third power, is because Turkey still has a common interest with countries such as Ukraine and Georgia, and Poland and Finland, and we can count many others, countries that are squeezed and face the threat of partition and occupation by two rival blocs. The Russian-Iranian versus American, in the case of Middle East, American, Saudi, Israeli axis, right? Turkey had a common interest with this third bloc of countries or societies and populations and actors who were cross-pressured by the Russian-Iranian axis on the one hand and the American, Saudi, Israeli axis on the other. That's why I called it the third power. And in the Syrian field, we see this immediately. Because on the one hand, you had the Russian-Iranian bloc, which has the biggest, of course, military presence on the ground. But on the other side, especially on the east of Euphrates, the American, just American and French troops, but also geopolitically American, Emirati, Israeli bloc, both of which supported for many years heavily militarized ethno-sectarian ideological minority dictatorships. Assad administration in southwest Syria, heavily supported by the Iranian army and Russian Air Force and Russian military at large, without which it could almost certainly not survive. They know that very well, I think, and so do the Russians and the Iranian policymakers. And to the east of Euphrates, the SDF-YPG formation statelet that could not hope to occupy and control that territory with an Arab majority if it wasn't for American Air Force, French Special Forces, and massive military economic aid from that bloc. Türkiye, which is a bitter irony, sided with the mostly Sunni Arab majority, but it remained as the only regional power of significance, of course, Qatar also for a very long time, that basically advocated this kind of third vision, which is now squeezed to northwest Syria, Idlib, Azez, Jarablus, North Aleppo territory. Which brings me to the final slide, which was also the final article published only less than 2 years ago, comparing now Turkey's grand strategy with the grand strategies of other great powers. I don't have time for going into the details, but of course there are many incompatibilities and compatibilities. I'm sorry I couldn't, touch as much on the Muslim majority power dimension, because one, of course, role that Turkey seeks to play is that of the missing Muslim power. It's covered in the Turkey's grand strategy article. This is a very much noted structural problem in world politics. There is no Muslim majority great power. There is an Orthodox great power. There is a Protestant hegemon, a superpower, and there was one in the previous 2 centuries. There is an East Asian, Buddhist, Hindu, Catholic great powers. Islam is exceptional in not having a great power in this top 5, 6, 7 of the world. And this plays a role also, as you would see if you read any of these articles. I would, though, be incomplete if I didn't mention the basically dip point of Turkey's revolutionary foreign policy, anti-systemic upsurge of Turkish strategy, coming to basically a dip point, which is 2022 and continuing. I've already noted in the 2017 article, Turkey and the Arab Spring, that by 2016-17, Turkey hit a wall in terms of its military economic capabilities, and it started seeking rapprochement with Russia. By 2022, we see this in the so-called normalization deals with every single significant counter-revolutionary Middle Eastern regional power, starting with the Emirates in February of last year, continuing with Saudi Arabia in April, June, continuing with Israel in August, and all of this is the same axis as I interpreted, the Saudi-Israeli Emirati axis, or Emirati-Israeli-Saudi axis, however you want to label it. And even the rumors with the photos of the handshake in the Qatar World Cup, rumors because it's not a full normalization yet, with Egypt, and finally, this is rumors, normalization with the Assad administration of southwestern Syria, and or, this is the, I think, most infamous rumor, the mass deportation, if it happens, of millions of Syrian refugees, which would, if it happens, and I hope it doesn't, and I'm strongly opposed to it on normative grounds, to both the normalization with the Assad administration of southwest Syria, and of course to the mass deportation. But as some of you follow the Turkish language media too, this has been the opinion of many sectors. I'm not talking about, I'm talking about across the political spectrum. But if either one of these happen, it would basically be the nail in the coffin of this revolutionary anti-systemic process. I thank you very much for your patience and for your invitation, for giving me the opportunity to kind of sum up the last 20-some years and see, to summarize what I think is actually a typical cycle of revolutionary upsurge, crashing, reaching some sort of material, economic, military limits, and then in a way normalizing, retrenching to a more status quo position in the international system. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Aktürk, for taking us through this very eye-opening journey of different grand strategies that Turkey has been pursuing. Dr. Aktürk talked about some of the most important imperatives in defining this grand strategy, or the geopolitical imperatives of Turkey, and he took them into 4 different eras: 1992, 2002, 12, and 22. And he said perhaps the overriding one was the diminishing of the Soviet-Russian threat. And he talked briefly about the different confrontations and wars between Türkiye and Russia, Imperial Russia, and then during the Cold War with the Soviet Union in the 18th and 19th century, and how Türkiye lost much territory to Russia. And then he said, considering, of course, what happened with the collapse of the Soviet Union, that was an opening for Türkiye with the diminishing of this threat. Now that we could find that there are buffer states between Türkiye and Russia, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and this decline gave free hand to Türkiye to move in different directions and assert its presence at the regional level. So the grand strategy was retooled as Russia was declining or receding as great power, and his conclusion or implication is that Russia will not reoccupy these lost territories. That was the conclusion of Turkish decision makers, which gave them the space to move in different directions. He also said there is structural fear. He pointed out that even within the military of the United States, another great power in the early 90s with the collapse of the Soviet Union, that there is this particular article that he pointed to that came in 2000 in a Journal of U.S. Armed Forces, in which there was an argument by some military officers of the United States that the rise of Turkey is a threat to become a regional hegemon in the Middle East. He says this is totally unnecessary or totally unrealizable, since we have 5 great powers who are balancing each other, or at least act as a balance against each other. He named Turkey, Iran, Israel, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia. Is it anyone that's trying to assert its hegemon situation it will be faced by others. I want to argue and consider that as one of the questions is that Israel does have a huge, I would say, I wouldn't call it total control, but a tremendous amount of control over Egypt and Saudi Arabia. So it's unlikely that at any point Saudi Arabia or Egypt in the foreseeable future could join another coalition against Israel. And we could see that in the East Mediterranean, for example. And Iran certainly is another one. So does that call for an Iran-Turkey axis to confront the axis of Israel, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, that is certainly supported by United States, which I was very surprised. I didn't read your paper. I would be very much interested to read your paper, why you think Turkish national interests align or are more compatible with America and the United Kingdom, big supporters of Israel. Anyway, irrespective, he said, of who is in power, the domestic origin of the revival of the Turkish power must be taken into consideration. So his second point was to talk about what he termed as the silent revolution with the rise of the AK party rule. And he said, and there's a long argument, I'm not going to repeat, but he talked about how this revolution taking place in the assertiveness of minorities, Kurdish and otherwise, and what he called the second-class citizenship of religious conservatives and ethnic minorities, while the judiciary, the military, and the high bureaucracy enjoyed for a long time being from one class. That has been changed because of the lengthy rule of the AK party, which also made a huge difference in the reorientation of Turkish grand strategy. And he talked a little bit about that silent revolution, which gave self-confidence to the people who are executing the foreign policy or the grand strategy of Turkey, both at the civil society institutions using democratic tools. He also talked about critical junctures between the European Union with the ascension and then the rebuffing of Turkish membership, as well as the Arab Spring and Muslim democracy. He said perhaps the grand strategy was for Turkey to talk about this Muslim majority rule or experience and to start to celebrate and try to be the catalyst for it. But with many actions that have taken place since then, certainly that has not panned out, has not worked. And then he mentioned several events that made a difference in that journey. The PKK offensive in 2015, the failed coup attempt in 2016, and certainly reorientation. I think perhaps the alliance between the nationalist MHP and perhaps that played a role after the 2018 elections. Perhaps that's something that could be considered in the eternal front. At any rate, he said that Turkey reached its peak in the grand strategy as a major revolutionary policy, which is the Muslim Muslim majority rule, which turned into the new grand strategy. Each one of these, by the way, was articulated in a paper he wrote, which would be advised for those people who want to follow this to read them in details. He talked about the Turkish grand strategy as a third power, where there is a realist reassessment. And he had an interesting quote concerning what that means. He said, Turkey does not suffer from an existential threat by its neighbors, but it suffers from existential conventional threat from the neighbors of its neighbors. That means that the neighbors of Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Armenia, Georgia, Azerbaijan, and so on and so forth, do not constitute a existential threat, but the neighbors of these countries, again, going back to the potential regional hegemon or a great power like Russia, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Italy, so on, those could actually pose a threat, as long as, he said, as long as these countries, the neighbors, are not occupied, which is a good qualification, because another question I would like to ask or talk is that there is a reason why America is in northern Syria. It has nothing to do with ISIS, in my view. I believe it has all to do with Turkey. And when Trump was for his own reasons trying to withdraw, because he wanted to save his friend Mohammed bin Salman at the time, and Erdogan was trying to negotiate his exit. So he thought, this is quid pro quo. We had the Secretary of Defense in the United States resigning over this. This could not be about, simply training Kurds. This was something much deeper than that, which I think it has to do with having Turkey turning inside and not to think about going outside. Anyway, I'd like to hear about your perhaps even Dr. Octav as well. At any rate, he also talked about Turkey could have now the freedom of maneuvering to extend its power outside because of the fall of the Soviet Union going back. He talked a bit about Turkish-Russian relations, Turkish-American relations, and how they would, and of course, I need to elaborate a bit about where we are, with the weakening of Russia and with the focusing, because if Russia loses Ukraine, that's the end of Russia. And Turkey certainly, I don't know if actually you advocate or would be a good thing for Turkey, for Russia to be disintegrating or to balance US power in the region. At any rate, he gave an example in his final point about the peace spring and the battle for free Syria. He came in favor, of course, of keeping the refugees in Turkey, and that any change in that will certainly kill this grand strategy. He talked briefly in his paper, which he did not elaborate, about US Türkiye, Russia Türkiye, China Türkiye, and with each there was one word. US and Türkiye are somehow aligned or compatible. Grand strategies, Russia and Türkiye are mostly incompatible. China and Turkey somewhat compatible. France mostly incompatible. UK and Turkey mostly compatible, which to me is exactly what I wouldn't want to see. Anyway, thank you so much. Our third presenter is Dr. Octav.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I feel very privileged to be with you in this afternoon. I would like to start my presentation by expressing my gratitude to the martyrs of Çanakkale, Dardanelles. It is the anniversary today. It's the anniversary of Çanakkale victory. And I will keep my presentation very brief, small, when compared with the two previous presentations. I would like to talk very briefly about the three different periods in Turkish foreign policy. In the first decade of the Turkish foreign policy under AKP, we can see that the Turkish foreign policy is conducted in a very traditional way, just like the foreign policy conducted by Atatürk and İsmet İnönü, and favoring status quo and following the interests of transatlantic partners. And in the first decade, you can see the continuation of traditional Turkish foreign policy, and the purpose is strengthening ties with the transatlantic partners. And in the wake of the critical domestic reforms, Turkey was granted a green light to the accession negotiations, to initiate the accession negotiations. And in the following this period, Turkey adopted the role of moderator, broker, and just tilted towards the policies more humane, favoring values and norms, and just wanted to be very powerful as a soft power. For example, the Turkish Cooperation Coordination Agency, TİKA, got very powerful, for example, especially in Africa, in different parts of the world. And there was no problem with the Western world, United States, etc. And Turkey also was granted as the term membership in the UN Security Council in 2009. But this decade came to an end with the outburst of the Arab Spring, unfortunately, and the Turkey's relations serious problem in relations with the United States. But unfortunately, with the beginning of the Arab Spring, everything changed in a negative way. And what happened, the turning point, yes, Arab Spring, but before the Arab Spring, in my opinion, Mavi Marmara was really big catastrophe in relations with the United States, and Turkey wanted to be a bridge between United States and Iran by elaborating an uranium enrichment agreement together with Brazil, and this annoyed Washington a lot, because this gave the image that Turkey was getting out of orbit of the West. I mean, because the big question in the minds of the transatlantic partners was that what is the main goal, ultimate goal of Turkey? Turkey wanted to be to continue to be a part of the reliable partner of the Western world, or wants to act as more independent player in the system, or game changer. And for example, Turkey started to express that it would have the potentiality to write the scenario rather than being rather than playing the role granted to it in that scenario. For example, this was perceived by Washington as a very challenging, and they started to make such comments. For example, Turkey is a limousine, but is a Cadillac, but acting like a limousine. This was a very interesting example in my mind. But with the outburst of the Arab Spring, Turkey just was exposed with different threats: the influx of the refugees, the increase in terror of Syrian branch of PKK, YPG, an incredible support of United States to YPG in the name of the battling against the radical Sunni Islamists, brutal terrorist organization ISIS. And ISIS and YPG all of a sudden came to be a big different threat on the border of Turkey with Syria. And Turkey, until the Arab Spring, as you all know, improved its trade relations not only with Syria, but also with Egypt to a large extent. But unfortunately, after these two threats, YPG and ISIS, and Americans piling the weapons to YPG, just finished everything. I mean, all the positive developments with the good neighborhood relations came to an end with the outburst of these two important actors, terrorist actors. And so why Turkey started to adopt a very combating rhetoric towards the EU as well as United States. This the main, according to many, I mean, in international relations experts area and experts, they just thought that the main driver of this change of rhetoric and the attitude of Türkiye was ideology, because the domestic politics and foreign politics were very much intermingled with each other during the period under AKP. Changing of domestic political landscape also became very influential in changing trajectory of Turkish foreign policy. At the core of this thinking was the understanding that since the early Republican period, Turkey had been enforced to follow the West in a way that were inimical to its national interests. Put differently, Turkey was always forced to act in favor of the interests of the Western world at the expense of its own nation state interests. This was the main idea in the minds of the foreign policy makers in Ankara. And this period should have been finalized, and the new period should have been started by Ankara because Türkiye had the potentiality of acting independently in foreign policy. In other words, Türkiye just felt that it was capable of acting freely from the Western world. And because this was mainly due to the changing parameters of international system as well. And but on the other hand, there was another interesting reality. This led to the transformation of society from a secular one to a more conservative one. I mean, just if you act freely from the West, you automatically is perceived as more conservative and tilting towards the Middle East, more Islamist, etc., and more Russian, favoring Russian interests maybe, and adopting more, China, for example, approaching China in the missile. There are a lot of examples coming to my mind now, but once upon a time, if you remember, Ankara wanted to buy Chinese missiles because the technology of missile was not granted by the United States. Yes, in defense technology, Turkey sought the different partnership, and China was an alternative, and this made Washington crazy, if you remember. And Turkey, as I mentioned, adopted a very combating, very harsh rhetoric towards EU, because according to Ankara, EU was applying double standard to Turkey. As Şener Hocam he mentioned that the Bulgaria, for example, when compared with Bulgaria, democracy in Turkey, of course, much more deeply rooted and developed. But when it comes to Turkey, EU never favored full membership of Turkey, because the reliability of Turkey as a partner of the West was very much weakened. I mean, was very much in a question in the minds of the Western partners, Western world, especially the EU policymakers, EU officials. And Turkey was adopted in the second decade very proactive policies. And these proactive policies led to another problematic situation. For example, Turkey openly sided with the Muslim Brotherhood. This also set the alarm bells of United States as well as Israel, for example. And this was unacceptable for Saudi Arabia, unacceptable for Iran, and for Russia. And Turkey gave the impression that it was tilting towards more Sunni radical groups. And Muslim Brotherhood was also, in the minds of, from the perspective of the West, was a terrorist organization. And Ankara siding with Muslim Brotherhood automatically gave the impression that Turkey is siding with a terrorist organization. looking from a different perspective, Ankara defended the idea that the Muslim Brotherhood was not a terrorist organization. In Egypt, for the first time in its history, Muslim Brotherhood came to power in a democratically way, and with the elections for the first time were held in Egypt, and Muslim Brotherhood as a political party came to power. But on the other hand, Washington, Brussels, the other capital cities of the countries, very much irritated by this attitude of Ankara. And this also was the violation of non-interference principle of traditional Turkish foreign policy. And this is really interesting, since the proclamation of Turkish Republic, we always witnessed the Turkey's favoring status quo, non-interference principle. But after the Arab Spring, Turkey started proactive policies and violated non-interference, just like it did in Syria, for example. Syrian Democratic Forces, not Syrian Democratic Forces, Syrian Free Army. Sorry, I made mistake, and the tried to oust the Bashar al-Assad from Damascus, tried to change the administration in Syria, and as I mentioned, in Egypt as well, violated non-interference principle. And Turkey's relations with Egypt, United Arab Emirates, and Israel, United States, EU, just got worsened and worsened after the outburst of Arab Spring, and this was the second decade of Turkish foreign policy under AKP. And then let me just talk about very briefly again the third decade, in my opinion. When this third decade started, this is my personal view, the question mark appeared in the minds of many in international relations, among the international relations experts. Is it an illusion that Ankara has gained strategic autonomy? To what extent Turkey is capable of, has the potentiality of following autonomous policies in its foreign policy? To what extent Turkey has the potentiality of diversifying its relations with the regional as well as the global countries, while keeping its NATO identity, while keeping its previous partnership with the Western world? When it comes to economic gains, we all know that the 40% of its export is still destined for EU countries, and the 6% with the UK and United States. Almost half of its exports still destined to Western countries. And in the second decade of the Turkish foreign policy under AKP, very much criticized. The most criticized point is that the foreign policy, Turkish foreign policy, not institutionalized. I mean, the foreign ministry bureaucracy, foreign minister are all excluded by the very powerful leadership in Ankara, Recep Tayyip Erdogan. And this was a big critic of Turkish foreign policy. And let me just tell the reason why so big critics were made by the Western world, basically by the Western world, to the Turkish foreign policy changing framework, whatever you say. But let me give you some examples why Turkish foreign policy under AKP and under the powerful leadership of Recep Tayyip Erdogan was so much heavily criticized. First, in my opinion, was the opening opening of Hagia Sophia took place, I mean, till 2020, and Hagia Sophia was a museum, you know, and on the 24th July 2020, Hagia Sophia was opened to the prayers. This created a big negative impact. This had a big negative impact on the Western world, on Greece, for example, on Orthodox world, on United States. This was a big challenge to the Western world by AKP leadership in 2020. It was, as you remember, Corona year, and there was no vaccination in that year. A lot of people just rushed to Hagia Sophia, and they prayed on Friday, on the 24th July, on the anniversary of Lausanne Agreement. This was really a big challenge to the Western world and to its alliance with the West. The second challenge, in my opinion, was the opening of ghost town Marash in Cyprus for settlement again in 2020, Corona year, in October 2020. The third challenge, the improving relations with the Turkish language speaking states, Turkic Council, and the strengthening of Turkic Council, also perceived as a big challenge by the Western world, and the ceremony of Turkish soldiers on the Baku street after Karabakh victory also was a big big disaster for the Armenians, as well as the Armenians big brothers like France and the United States, etc. And when we remember all these developments, you see the third decade of Turkish foreign policy was perceived really very challenging, very threatening, and very out of orbit, and uncontrolled, and not very difficult to control. Therefore, in my opinion, at the present time, today, the elections are coming, the coming elections, and very little time left to 14th May in 2023. And I think the Western world very much monitoring what will happen after the elections, and they never want to see the AKP on power, basically for these reasons. But criticizing so harshly and criticizing Turkey so harshly is not, in my opinion, is not, I couldn't find the suitable word, not fair, maybe. Not unfair. This is very unfair, because when you look at the very close friend of United States, Saudi Arabia made the agreement with Iran under the brokership of China. And the agreement, the language of agreement is not English, was Persian, Chinese, and Arabic. This shows us that the United States is challenged not only by Turkey, but at the same time by the countries like Saudi Arabia. And United Arab Emirates also made a great approached Türkiye to a large extent during the earthquake. And the Erdogan thanked to United Arab Emirates for a long time when he was addressing to the people in the earthquake region. So, but the issue is that, I'm finishing my presentation, the issue is that Türkiye, unlike Saudi Arabia, unlike Iran, unlike Russia, Türkiye has an identity. This is the NATO identity. This is the This is the identity of strategic partnership of the Western world, transatlantic partnership. And this identity, we have to think over that this identity is to the advantage of Turkey's nation state interest, or it is still an advantage to Turkey. When it comes to the relations with the East, Turkey's NATO identity very much disadvantageous for Turkey, because from the Iranian perspective, for example, Turkey is not reliable because it has a NATO identity. From the perspective of Western world, Turkey, yes, it has an identity, NATO identity, but it is getting out of orbit. A big question mark in the minds of the Westerners. Therefore, the second question of mine, there should be an identity of Turkish foreign policy, and what kind of an identity Turkey should adopt in its foreign policy. And again, I would like to repeat the previous question. Was it an illusion that Turkey has the potentiality of acting freely from the West as a geostrategic actor on the regional level as well as on global level? Thank you very much for your patience, and this was very illuminating session in the afternoon. Thank you very much for your invitation again.
Thank you so much, Dr. Octav, for your presentation. You're right on time. Dr. Octav talked about 3 different periods of Turkey's foreign policy. The first was during the AK Party, that is. The first was the traditional way of previous regimes that came before the AK Party in 2002, with the continuation of strengthening the ties with the transatlantic, mainly NATO and the West, and where they had the green light for ascension to the European Union membership. And they emphasized the human value, the human rights and the values and international norms and so on. And Turkey during that time used its soft power, such as the use of TICA. So it didn't have really many problems with the United States or the West generally. It had a membership within the United Nations Security Council in 2009. And that period stayed till about the Arab Spring, which was the second phase of that relationship, and perhaps even before, after the Mavi Marmara incident, which came before the Arab Spring year before. The main goal of Turkey, she says, was to be a reliable partner or act as an independent player in a system. Is it to write a scenario where Turkey is writing a scenario, or to being a player by others writing the scenario, as she put it? And of course, the West prefers that kind of relationship where Turkey is player within a scenario that is written by the others. In that phase, there was a different scenario that was being written in Arab capitals with emerging threats to Turkey, such as the threat of the influx of the refugees, the YPG, PKK axis in northern Syria that was threatening Turkey's borders. And of course, Turkey could not leave that threat unanswered. And certainly that did not please the West. It wanted to have its own charted policy. She asked the question, why does Turkey have a combative policy towards the West, particularly the United States and the European Union? She said there are many reasons, partly ideology. There is a domestic and foreign policies are intermingled. These are not independent. And with the understanding that Turkey was following the West for a long time before that, but Turkey always was forced to back Western interests, particularly during the Cold War, despite that this could be against its national interest. So it was time to change and act independently and freely from the dictates of the Western world, which came obviously with a price. And with the change in that, certainly that comes also as domestically, Turkey was turning into more conservative political class than with the past, which also comes with other changes such as being pro-Russia or pro-Chinese policies. And it was combative also towards the EU because of many reasons, because Europe was applying double standards regarding Turkey, such, vis-a-vis, for instance, Bulgaria, where it has less experience with democracy, yet it was accepted easily. The rehabilitation, the reliability of Turkey had been weakened. Turkey adopted a proactive policy, also like siding with the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood after the Arab Spring, which was natural, since the Arab Spring, the Muslim Brotherhood was winning elections, which is what Turkey was arguing, while its enemies would argue that these were extremists or terrorists, despite the fact that they were winning elections. The third angle, or the third era, came after after Turkey became disillusioned with the Western positions, and it wanted to assert more of its autonomous and independent policy. I didn't have a date, perhaps 2018. Come on. Oh, very good. Yes, you said that. Yes. Yeah, with the third decade, you did say third decade. Yes, Corona, third year. And said that the foreign policy in Turkey was not institutionalized, as the presidency has taken an oversized influence in Turkish foreign policy, while other institutions were not as active. The Turkish foreign policy was heavily criticized by the West for many reasons. She gave three. One had to do with the Hagia Sophia opening, one had to do with the Marash in Cyprus in October 2020, the third with the involvement of Turkey with the Turkish or the Turkic-speaking world, and certainly extending the influence there. Dr. Ktab said that foreign policy of Turkey is being perceived as threatening to the West, while they are certainly monitoring the elections here. She says it's not fair how they are singling out Turkey in that situation. She talked about the example of the China, Saudi Arabia, Iran deal as an example of that kind of double standard. Turkey has an identity, and it has a strategic partnership with the West for over half century. And it would be an advantage to NATO, certainly, not to be alienated. From the perspective of Iran, of course, Turkey is not reliable because it is part of NATO. At any rate, the identity of the foreign policy of Turkey was an illusion to think that Turkey could act independently, and that's what could distinguish Turkey. I want to thank all of our three speakers. Now we're going to turn to our discussant. Doctor, he's been very patient listening for 2 hours. Now it's his turn to give us his commentary. Dr. Ali.
Thank you very much for your invitation, Professor Sami, to be a part of this impressive and very good symposium on the Turkish foreign policy and security policy, and to listen these impressive and very wonderful presentations. I think that I can overcome this huge and very big problem to shift our focus from one point to the other point, I think. I think I don't need 15 minutes because I only focus on one point. Our presenters are, professor says, our professors focuses on the transformation of Turkey's minds in different ways. For example, Professor Aslan has mentioned about the transformation in this domestic relations between civil and military relations, and Professor Aktürk has mentioned about the grand strategy, the transformation grand strategy of Türkiye, and Professor Octav explained the relations of Türkiye with the Western world. I would like to, but all of them are from the side of inside of Türkiye. Maybe we can add another point to Türkiye's transformation by looking at the by focusing on the transformation outside Türkiye. So I think the transformation outside Türkiye in recent decades, maybe until since the 1980s, can be a very influential, can be considered as a very influential thing on the transformation inside Türkiye, I think. So the main point is, my main point is on the globalization, the transformation on globalization, from the neoliberal understanding to a more harsh understanding. I think I really focus on this point. As we know, and by integrating the factors that our professors mentioned to this transformation on globalization, the perspectives on the Turkiye's transformation can be more comprehensible and can be a very understandable for me, I think. As you know, from Washington Consensus to global financial crisis, the neoliberal understanding on globalization has been a domination on the globalization understanding, especially in the Western world. And the Western world can use this understanding, these neoliberal discourses, to force the non-Western actors in the world to be in alliance with them. So, and non-Western worlds can not refuse or didn't have such tools to refuse this enforcement by the Western world. So Turkey is one of them, and it is very hard for the non-Western world to refuse or to reject some thing that is in contrast to their national interest. So this is very hard for them. And the main discourse of neoliberal understanding on globalization is that the more the world's globalized, then the better we have, the better our lives will be. So, but especially after the global financial crisis, maybe we can take the history to the invasion of United States to the Iraq. Maybe we can turn back to this history. After these developments, the neoliberal understanding has some collapses on this argument to that the more world is globalized, the better we have life, the better the life we have. So after the global financial crisis, these claims have lost its influence on, especially even in the Western world, I think, and there is some skepticism and there is some criticisms on this neoliberal understanding emerged in, especially in the Western world, even in the Western world. So this and the Western world, the globalization cannot overcome the globalized problems as it has claimed in the beginning. So this insufficiency of globalization to overcome the globalized problems has opened a room for non-Western world to refuse the arguments of Western world. So non-Western worlds like Russia or Iran or China has tried to utilize from this opportunity, and they try to develop their own discourses. For example, Turkey has developed the world is bigger than 5 discourse, or China developed its discourse on the relationship between equals, or Russia started directly to threat the Western world on Ukraine or Europe. So there has this insufficiency of globalization has opened room for the non-Western world, and this is a very important thing for our from my perspective on the globalization, and I think the references of our professors has really is supported this thing, I think. For example, Professor Aslan's argument on the civil and military relations is one example of the influence of this gapping in the discourses on globalization for Türkiye. And Professor Aktürk's argument on the rapprochement between counter-revolutionary countries like Turkey and Iran is is another example of this gapping of these gaps, I think, for just a period. I know that this picture has been threatened by some developments. For example, the counter-revolutionary countries cannot overcome the globalized problems. The Western world cannot overcome, but also non-Western world cannot also find some solutions to these globalized problems, and problems becomes more uncontrollable today. For example, like climate change, for example, migration, for example, financial crises all over the world, for example, geopolitical risks, and no country cannot control no other country. So there is the picture in front of us seems to be like a chaotic environment right now, I think. So Türkiye, like the other counter-revolutionary countries, is in this chaotic environment and tries to find its way to overcome its own problems, and also tries to keep itself in a secure place from the problems in other parts of the world. So I think it's the picture in front of us, and these impressive presentations from our dear professors is really informative for me and for developing these arguments. I repeat, I'm really thankful for you for your invitation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kahraman. Now we're going to turn to any comments. I do have my questions, which I will leave until the end. Does anybody have any other comments? Okay.
Thank you. I would like to thank Dr. Amar Aslan. We were actually at home discussing where is the army during the earthquake. We need people. Where is the army? Yeah, and we thought that maybe there is some powers afraid of the army, and I get the answer. There is a trust issue. And my question will be for Zeynep Hocam regarding Turkey and this turning points and their political decisions. I'm wondering what Turkey can do else rather doing it this way. For example, sometimes a child hit the table against his parents to tell something. For example, the European Union was, negotiating with Turkey for years and years, and without Turkey couldn't get any result. So they wanted to say, okay, we are leaving the table to see what are you going to do. So Turkey does not want to remain ruled by the West visions and decisions without a realistic results on grounds, from my point of opinion. And Turkey knows that every decision has its own price. And whenever they feel that they have that much of self-esteem or trust themselves, they gave the decision. And I think there is a latest example of Sweden, if I'm right, about when they allow that person to burn the Quran, despite its need for Turkey to support them in NATO. So I can understand Turkey's decisions. This is my point of view. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah.
So thank you for your great presentations.
تحديدا في سياق الحديث عن الجيش وديمقراطية الجيش بحيث يصبح جيش مدني ذكي ويعني نوعي أكثر.
As for the army and the process of democratization,
الأمور حيال الجيش تتجه، أنا أنقل حرفيا، الأمور حيال الجيش تتجه باتجاه معين، قال هكذا، ويجب
who said that? مين قال هيك؟
الدكتور عمر.
اوكي.
باتجاه معين، قال تتجه باتجاه معين ولم يكمل، ويجب فعل شيء وهكذا. أنا أسأل السؤال: إلى أين تتجه الأمور اليوم تراها في هذه المرحلة الفاصلة؟ وهل هناك
تكهنات في فترة الانتخابات التي نحن مقبلون عليها؟
Okay. The way he heard you saying in the translation is that things with the army are not clear. So can you elaborate? Can you explain what that means with the army, between the army and the civilians? And is there a possibility, he is asking, that the army could interfere in the elections, coming elections? One of the questions. Okay.
شق سريع أرجو يعني بس المشكلة أيضا أثار المشكلة بين السلطة والحركات الإسلامية، فأنا أسأله سؤال يعني برأيك ما هو الحل الجذري لهذه الإشكالية المكلفة ليس فقط في تركيا وإنما في كل المنطقة.
And as far as your comment about the relationship between the Islamic movements and militaries, what would be the ultimate ideal solution from your point of view about that relationship?
ممكن كمان أسأل سياسة الدكتور شنار إن أمكن، سياسات الدفاع والأمن القومي والضرورات الاستراتيجية هي مصطلحات كبيرة يعني. هل برأيك في فترة حزب العدالة والتنمية تم وضع يعني محددات أو يعني تم إبراز هذه المصطلحات بطريقة تليق بالدولة التركية، أم أنه يعني أرجو السماح يعني بالمصطلح تم إهانة هذه المصطلحات، يعني تم سياسات الدفاع والأمن القومي والضرورات الاستراتيجية، يعني فقط أنا أستخدم المصطلحات في العنوان يعني. نعم. سؤال أخير إذا تكرم.
He said the use of the word defense policy, national security imperative, strategic imperative, have these been defined by the decision maker in Turkey, or we're just using them loosely? So when you say strategic imperatives, do we have one understanding within the Turkish power structure of this, or does it mean something to you and something to someone else? And also, when we talk about defense policy, is it the same everywhere? I'm talking about the elite, not I'm talking about the normal man in the street. Do they have the same understanding? And what is it? طيب.
سؤال أخير للدكتورة زينب. في ظل العقد الثالث من صمود حزب العدالة والتنمية في العقد الثالث، يعني كلنا مجمعون أنه واجه تحديات وجودية، يعني ليس فقط على مستوى الحزب، أنا أتكلم عن مستوى الدولة التركية وليس أقلها الانقلاب طبعا الذي حصل في تركيا. السؤال: إلى أي مدى حافظت تركيا على استقلال هويتها عن الغرب خلال حزب العدالة في ظل الضغوطات النيوليبرالية التي تفضل بها الأستاذ، الغير أخلاقية، يعني بين قوسين أنا أستخدم ازدواجية المعايير، وهل كانت محقة في ذلك العدالة والتنمية يعني؟ شكرا.
The third question is Dr. Zeynep about the ACT party, which faced existential threats during its rule, particularly with the coup. He said, to what extent was Türkiye able to preserve its independence in front of all these challenges and the use of double standards by the West? Does it have to compromise, or is it really asserting its independence and autonomy? Okay, so we have a lot of questions here. I would like to add to your miseries, to your questions a little bit. We have time. We're going to end, inshallah, by 6 o'clock. So that would give each one of you about 12 minutes or so. When it comes to have we passed that phase in Turkey? Or can you foresee any circumstances? Obviously, people could see circumstances, but they are extremely remote for the army to interfere in the United States, because there is no history, and it's very difficult to imagine with the existing institutions. But within the Turkish politics, can we, even though people could see, past that long, but can you see, or can you foresee any scenario? What would be these scenarios, and what would be needed for that to become a remote possibility? Because that could be a lesson to be learned from other Muslim societies where the arms are still having a grip, because you looked at the four structures. And finally, this thing, it's very interesting, because this is the first time I hear it about Turkey turning into a nation, the army being part of the fourth category. If you can elaborate a little bit about that. And the second question for Dr. Shinar, which to me was fascinating, and I would certainly read the papers and re-invite you to discuss, but I understand, basically your argument. But what I do not understand, or maybe perhaps it has to do with history, or maybe it has to do with preferences. In other words, it's not inevitable. This aligning of the West's, because I can make another argument, the West's that compatibility with Turkish interest. Yes, there were a lot of bad history between Russia and Turkey for many centuries. Yet the United States does not want Turkey that is independent, does not want Turkey that could chart its own power, where it becomes, I wouldn't call it hegemon, but becomes powerful state, where it can actually dictate its own policies and rise. That is totally contrary to every grand strategy of the US, where it wants to be, particularly in this part of the world, it does want to be the hegemon, but at least not another power that can challenge its policies with the presence of Israel. So every single indicator tells me that Turkey, as Dr. Zainab said, would not be given the opportunity to be independent. In fact, they liked the old Turkey, where it, even if it doesn't like it, that it will just follow the dictates. It will follow the role that is been given to it. Once Israel starts challenging Israel, once Turkey starts taking a different tone or a different policy, then immediately they're going to call the goons and try to. So if you can elaborate a little bit. If you say this is historical, I understand, but if you're arguing that this is supposed to be, that's what I don't understand. And finally, for Dr. Octav, regarding again, you have reached a conclusion, and maybe similar conclusion, but why would you argue? Again, I understand the history, that the future of Turkey is necessarily to become part of the existing power structure. Why can't we think outside the box and think of a scenario? It may take 50 years, but at least a scenario outside this Western alliances. If you look at the Muslim world, extending as, let's say, Avakan's envision, from Nigeria to the group of 8, for instance. It came yesterday or today in the economics. But what can we make this into something that is more of a third power that can be neither Western nor Eastern, but they can rise with Turkey being at the center of it, because Turkey certainly is the power that could lead such an alliance. I wouldn't say that this is a military alliance or a trade alliance, but somehow it could come in the future to become a third possibility outside this NATO EU type of alternative power. Well, let's talk about that. I'm going to give each one of you 12 minutes, no problem. We have time, 11, 12 minutes.
Thank you. Let me just begin, spare maybe 1 minute to this earthquake. Again, we don't know much about this earthquake. I think how come the decision wasn't taken to use the military when they have this huge manpower. There are different theories, I think, about this out there. But what I wanted to focus with this earthquake point is thinking about other examples in other countries in similar emergency situations. My point was, how come this didn't happen? Because if it didn't come to their minds, then that shows us something, which is again interesting. If it did come to their mind, but somehow somebody prevented them from putting the soldiers out, then again, this shows us something about power dynamics. But I think in the end, it's a very interesting decision that they took at this emergency moment. When I talked about, I think things aren't clear. Well, I don't remember exactly at what point I expressed the sentence, but I have been at the police academy too. And the police and the military are different in terms of shaping them, in terms of influencing them. I think police has been, of course, by their job, I think has been closer to the society. They live among the society. It's easier to come across them, live in the same apartment with them. So politicians too, it's easy to replace them and then influence them and then shape them, appoint them, and so on. So they're closer to, I think, have been closer to many different political parties. But the military is a stranger, I think, to the Islamic movements in Turkey too, not just the AK Party, but the previous ones as well. If we call them a community, I think the military has been like a foreign entity. It's like a stranger. We don't know them that well. So it's been, I think, this process after 2016, getting to know the military well, getting closer to them, even maybe encouraging people to enter the military and get training and then rise through the ranks. This is a very slow process. We don't know them very well. So that's, I think, one of the reasons why there is still a gap and a confidence, because they don't feel, I think, still that they don't know the army very well as they should, they feel. I mean, so compared to the police, I think, especially. So how they want to feel confident with the army is basically, that's why I think Akar is, for instance, the defense minister now. He gives you this kind of an assurance that there is this person who survived the coup, who was with us at that moment. And then if we make him the defense, he knows the military, he knows who to appoint, because we don't know these people very well and so on. I think this is how they try to feel at least somehow confident with the military. Interference in elections, of course, I will take it to be a larger question in terms of military intervention, because interference in elections, I don't think we have very clear examples of interference in elections in the sense of, let's say, manipulating the vote count or the ballot in this sense. We have had in the past, I think, right before 1950 elections, way back, when Democrat Party was about to win, on both sides, I think, as far as I know, on both the advocates of Democrat Party, but also the Republican People's Party, CHP, officers close to both sides, they offered to interfere with elections back then. After 1980 coup, the military government, of course, wanted to, I think, influence the elections too, but not in the sense of, not like in other countries where the military is directly involved. Some ballot, the papers are disappearing and then others are created. In that case, we don't have the military interference. But military intervention wise, when just Professor Sami was talking about the United States and how it is difficult to imagine a scenario, think about Trump and Capitol Hill events. So people back and before Trump, they would always say, I would say too, I mean, you can never imagine a situation in the United States that would be a coup attempt. But big professors in the US they are still discussing whether Capitol Hill was a coup attempt. And now I think we have many accounts by people close to Trump saying that Trump actually wanted the generals to do something about the election. So again, we can choose which side to believe, but there can be a scenario, I think, of course, still. So after that Capitol Hill, I never discount that there would be a possibility, there couldn't be a possibility in which a military could intervene. One thing that I think gives me a bit confidence still, there is a big literature about if there is a recent coup that fails, that really discourages further coup conspirators in the military, because that history becomes a common knowledge among the military officers that to think about in 2020, if you are a conspiracy group within the army and then you are thinking about doing something, you would immediately remember that 2016 people resisted, Erdogan resisted, there is something here, it's still fresh. But how long does that count? How many years does that count for? We don't know. I have never seen any article about this. So when does that memory disappear or fade in people's and officers' also mind in this regard? But my point in my presentation too, in also responding to about this nation's army argument, my point of departure has been this democratic control of armed forces. So whichever government comes in, the military should obey. Of course, there are, obedience to a civilian government, I think, is more complicated than we just say it here. But in the end, the final word, again, belongs to elected civilians because they carry the legitimacy that elections and people's vote for them give. So in this sense, to make military intervention, I think, even more impossible or even more difficult, not impossible, but more difficult, would be not just relying on the 2016 memory, but also strengthening institutions, civilian institutions, I think starting with the parliament too. In the morning session, Professor Babacan talked about this 2018, but also 17, with the presidential system. There is a structural, I think, weakness now. Things are hinging on persons and personalities rather than institutions. So parliament is even weaker, I think, in the system than even before. So people, so the parliamentary control over the military is still lacking. So this is one of the things that I think we should strengthen in this case, but also defense ministry. I'm not sure if anyone imagines who is going to be the defense minister after Akar, if anyone becomes the defense minister after him, and then how will that look like? Because we can go deeper on this, but Akar shapes a lot of things with the army. If there is a general within the army that rises, there have been, if you remember, a couple of generals who looked into Syria, and they became all of a sudden popular. People in the media, too, TV channels were talking about these generals, like this Pasha, he's good, and so on. All of a sudden, Akar wanted this guy down because he is becoming more charismatic and so on. There have been, I think, 2 or 3 instances as such. So he determines things, but what about after him? Like, how do we shape? So things are, to me, seem more like a temporary right now. So we need to give them a more permanent footing in this sense. So the nation's army. I have been following President Erdogan's speeches when he does those at very high platforms, such as National Defense University graduates, officers every year in August. So I'm checking Erdogan's speeches from 2016 onwards until this past year, 2022. There's a clear, I think, change towards Erdogan wants. So last year he made, I think, most interesting speech in which he said, he talked about land forces, the army officers, and then Air Force officers, and then the Navy officers. He said, you know, our army officers are like Ottoman soldiers. You know, they go on jihad, they go on war, saying, you know, God's name, you know, Allah, and so on. That's how he referred to them. He said, our Air Force officers, you know, appreciate the beauty that the God created because they look at this thing from the sky. And then the Navy officers, they again, so it always, the reference is so now distinct, have become distinct. So he wants them, he wants something like an army of devout generals. So reflect the society more and more and more. I'm not saying that, of course, there should be, but he puts a definition of identity on the army. But then what about, I mean, of course, the Islamic movements in Turkey are not related, restricted to our party, you know, they will continue. So there is the risk that is being created, I think, with this. So that's what I meant by the nation's army. And the way that the discourse goes, the more, more and more it looks to me like leader equals party equals nation equals country equals military. Exactly. Yeah. There is that gap too, definitely. And that also gives it more temporary character as well. At this point, it's not like a permanent. That's why these are the first signals. But going on this path, I don't see a nice. I don't see a good ending here. That's why. So if you do this, let's say in 4 or 5 years, if you create such an army, then the government changes, then how does that army behave towards that government? We don't want this either. We want a more democratic, obedient, army. Powerful army, but at the same time that. So balance these two things out, I think, is the most difficult challenge that will face the government.
Thank you very much for all your questions. I'll try to answer them, but I suspect that after the first answer, you might not listen to the rest. But, please bear with me because my answer is, affirmative, negative, and I'll tell you why. It is written there. It's structural, it's historical structural, and that kind of threat is still there, and it's not just potential, it's real. Your suggestion that somehow Iran could be an ally of sorts to Turkey, this has been voiced by some people in different times, but Iran has been actively positioned against Türkiye and Türkiye's immediate allies in almost every military and political theater of operation. Syria being the most horrendous one, of course, but so is Azerbaijan. Iran supported Armenia in the Karabakh conflict over and over again. And even in the Lachin corridor, they voiced, Zangezur corridor, they voiced opposition. In every kind of like Turkey's, joint operation with Free Syrian Army, even more than United States in many cases, it was Iran and Iran's proxies who immediately, tried to stop that advance. So I think Iranian geostrategists think Turkey as a threat, and the Syrian theater is a very good example of that, in the sense that when Free Syrian Army and Turkey advances, both the pro-American French, YPG, PYD, and the Russian-Iranian supported Assad regime leave aside their differences. They collaborate to stop Türkiye and Free Syrian Army, which shows to us over many years of experience over and over again in every operation that for both the American-Israeli Emirati axis and the Russian-Iranian axis, it's the Turkish-Syrian alliance that is the greater threat. Now we can talk about, because that's, I think the reasons are obvious why that is the case, but I think this kind of popular democratic majority ruled Middle East would be a Middle East, if it's ever realized, that would get rid of these Iranian proxies from out of power, definitely in Damascus, to a certain extent, probably across Iraq and Beirut as well. That's why, despite the fact that Turkey made many goodwill gestures, the biggest one being what Zeynep Hoca mentioned, the Iran-Brazil deal, which I suspect, now I don't have insider knowledge, but I suspect that many think was a big mistake and an example of backstabbing. I think when they look back, they probably think, why did we do this? Just so that Iran could backstab us a few years later. Why did we, put ourselves in the firing, lane of Western powers? What did we gain from? Trying to get Iran on Turkey's side? Now, if you want, if we want to look historically, structurally, Iran, Safavid Iran, Shah Iran, they've almost always, I'm trying to think of an exception, but I can't really think one, have been allies of France, Habsburg Empire, Russia, whatever is the anti-Turkish, anti-Ottoman alliance, Iran has been part of it. So, so there is a reason why sometimes people say, you can change, regimes, you can change ideologies, but you can't change geography. There's a geography there. It has been there. It has been ruled by Turkish dynasties for a very long time. Safavids were Turkish, so were Qajars, until basically Pahlavi and the revolution. Iran was ruled by Turkic dynasty, so it has nothing to do with ethnicity either, for example. Yes, Safavid definitely were Turkic. Shah Ismail Safavi, we can read his poems and understand them, even as modern Turkish speakers. So it has. That's why I think it's geopolitics and realism 101. Iran's, position has been anti-Turkish, and in that sense, the damage that the Iranian policy and its proxies, and Iran has cultivated both pro-Iranian, both the sectarian and the ethnic divides in Turkey too, right? I don't want to go into too much detail. And your suggestion that somehow, for example, I don't want to be, I'm just trying to be very clear that somehow, for example, to defend the Arab rights and as a resistance to the occupation of Palestine, Iran would provide an opportunity. I disagree. I think Iran is the favorite ideal kind of boogeyman for Israel because it can't really harm Israel. It's a permanent kind of, its proxies are permanent minorities. It doesn't have the military demographic, it faces a huge legitimacy gap. And I also, as part of grand strategy, I read, among many other countries, examples of what Israeli grand strategy sees as a threat. Definitely the Arab states, let's not lose sight of the biggest thing, it's Egypt, right? It's Egypt. That's why the revolution was extremely important, the July coup. It's after all, Sunni Arab 100 million. But if it's not that, is Iran as a farther threat, or is it Turkey as a, far away non-neighboring state? Potentially even than Turkey, because it has the potential to rally the region behind a regional integration scheme, which could force withdrawal from occupied territories, East Jerusalem, and so on and so forth. So I don't think, again, I'm kind of coming back to Syria. For example, Netanyahu is the best friend of Putin when it comes to foreign relations. So it's also not true that Israel somehow is, always has as its great patron ally, United States as number one. I've written on Russian soft power across the region. In the Israeli elections, we have a huge poster in the Likud headquarters, Netanyahu and Putin shaking hands, because that actually gets votes to Likud and Netanyahu being pro-Russian. So what I'm saying is that the invitation to occupy Syria has been condoned by Obama, who didn't enforce the red line. And of course, Putin did the intervention himself, but also by Israel. So I think we should look at the Syrian field and see which forces come together whenever there is even an inch, a town of expansion in the Northwest. Your example was very good. Pat Robertson said Trump is going to lose the mantle of heaven. I cited this. If the Christian Zionist leader, Pat Robertson, said, if Trump removes these American troops from Syria, he's going to lose mantle of heaven. And who agreed with him? Noam Chomsky. This is one example in the history of American intelligentsia that Noam Chomsky and Pat Robertson, the Christian Zionist scion, and the leftist critic agreed, because that's exactly what happens when it comes to Russian-Iranian axis and the American-Israeli axis agreeing in Syria every time Türkiye advances in defense of the majority population. So this is, I think I've wrapped it up. As for the great, I mean, this is my opinion. Obviously, I'm in the minority, actually, probably even in Turkey on this, but still, I mean, I think these are the facts. And it's not just Syria, it's also Azerbaijan, Caucasus, and many other fields. As for great powers, I think there's a slight misunderstanding. Yes, of course, and it's a rare kind of, yes, I am, when I compare it to Russia, China, and the other UN Security Council members, I find Turkey's priorities closer or interests more compatible with some of the Anglo-American axis. But that's again because of geopolitics. Russia could occupy, and Iran could occupy too, but it wouldn't right now. Turkey territorially, United States couldn't. Neither could Britain. And today we are actually commemorating one of the greatest defeats of the British Navy in history, the Gallipoli. Right? So when they attempted to put Al-Amara in Iraq or in Gallipoli, they failed. So the immediate land occupation threat it's always, that's what the geopolitics, it's always from the nearest neighbors. So you always fear the neighboring great power more than the faraway great power, because the neighboring great power actually can swallow you, like Russia swallows Georgia, Azerbaijan, Ukraine, or Finland. I don't think it will. But one dimension that is in the article, the great strategy, and I believe this, but not in the presentation, is that for every UN security member, and it makes a lot of sense to mention this in the Center for Islam and Global Affairs, every UN security member has a domestic Muslim question, Muslim problem. China has Xinjiang, East Turkestan, and Turkey is the home to the largest Uyghur population in the world outside of China. Russia has the Chechnya trauma, especially the Putin administration, which has been a genocidal reoccupation, right? Or, in a population of 1 million, more than 100,000 have been killed. France has the Algerian trauma, which it just can't get over, and it's domestic Muslim representation problem. United States, I mean, I went to the US for college in 1999, didn't have this. It was actually one of the few, but now it has it after September 11 and, Afghanistan and occupation of Iraq and many others, but not as much and as critically as Chechnya for China, Xinjiang for Chechnya for Russia, Xinjiang, Turkestan for China, or Algerian trauma, which is more central to France. And Britain doesn't have, it's the most accommodative of Islamic practices and rituals and, religiosity and, animal sacrifice, circumcision, Sharia law, common law, all of these of the great powers. It doesn't mean it doesn't clash with Türkiye's or other states' interests. That's why I said, the third strategy that Turkey should weave together, and I think many of us are on agreement on this, Turkey should weave together, I say in the article, from Pakistan to Algeria, from Ukraine and Lithuania to Finland, a network of states that feel disenfranchised and pressured by the current global structure. Because none of these 5 UN security members would be a, natural ally for Turkey or many of these countries. But I still think Poland, Finland, Ukraine, these are non-Muslim countries. They are natural allies for Turkey. Pakistan is a natural ally for Turkey. Algeria is a natural ally for Turkey. We can mention many such. That's why, it actually veers towards more, not non-aligned movement, but kind of, stake out an autonomy within Western alliance type of thing. That's exactly, that was my point. And the discussant and audience comments, I think they are, there wasn't a discussant question, but I never would say that Turkey is a counter-revolutionary country. In fact, it's the last revolutionary country that is just, retreating. It's no longer pursuing or actively, as of last year only, it's no longer actively pursuing, advocating democratization, popular rule in Egypt or, in the Gulf. But until then it did, and it was the final country to drop that position with the normalization, not drop, but kind of freeze. So I would not say Turkey is counter-revolutionary, because that would mean Turkey is actively trying to suppress some, democratic uprising in Arab countries. It's not doing that, unlike Russia or Iran or Saudi Arabia or, or United States. Turkey isn't actively trying to suppress any bottom-up democratization movement in the Middle East. The center chose the title of my presentation. Actually, I didn't. I just this is Mr. Iyad's question. That title isn't my title. I just adopted the title that was offered to me and tried to fill it under. But as to your question, of course, there isn't a full agreement. I mean, there isn't a full agreement at all on Turkey's geopolitical identity either. Historically, we used to, still school children refer to Yusuf Akçura, the Kazan Tatar, the three styles of politics, pan-Islamism, pan-Turkism, and it used to be Ottomanism, now Westernism. I wrote an article in 2005, it's called 15, fourth style of politics, pro-Russian Eurasianism, because with the collapse of Soviet Union, we now have a small but influential elite group of people who say, don't look to, you know, Tashkent or Mecca or Brussels, look to Moscow as your, you know, as Turkey's number one ally, Eurasianist, Evrasisti or Avrasyaci. So in terms of Turkey's geopolitical identity, yeah, there is no agreement. And I don't think there is no, but the thing is there a full agreement on the geopolitical identity of any power? We can never expect 100% agreement. But you would also be right if you said, you know, that in the Turkish case, there is no, because of this European rebuffing, that's why I emphasized 2005, if the negotiations continued, right, for EU membership. Because it's my opinion, and I think Zeynep Hoca has also mentioned, that, you know, Turkish economy and democracy was more vibrant than Bulgaria or Romania. It could have been accepted. History would have been very different. But Europe couldn't digest it. I mean, and that's because of the French-Algerian trauma. That's because of Germany's Islam question. It's their domestic problem that they project onto Turkey because they couldn't yet. I mean, I wrote a piece on attempt to prohibit male circumcision across 6 Scandinavian countries. This came to the parliaments of Iceland, you know, Sweden, Norway, and if it wasn't for Anti-Defamation League and the American Jewish lobby groups, male circumcision, which is essential for Judaism and quite a bit for Islam, would have been banned by now in Iceland and Norway and Sweden. I mean, this is how far prohibition of Islamic practices, from, you know, ritual animal slaughter, Qurban, to male circumcision, to azan in the public, to headscarf. I mean, there have been waves and waves of prohibition, and that domestic problem, inability to accommodate public visibility of Islam, is reflected, as is very well known, to Turkey's membership. Even Bosnia's or Albania's membership is probably among the most secularized post-communist Muslim states in the world. So that's the, otherwise, you know, we would have been speaking in a very different environment, you know, Turkey as a member of the EU next to Germany, but that didn't happen. That history didn't happen, and we still don't know where Turkey's geopolitical identity will land. Again, I mean, to be idealistic, I would say, okay, you know, European integration followed the destruction of Europe after the Second World War. Middle East, especially the Iraqi-Syrian landscape, has been destroyed. This could have been an opportunity for regional integration in the Middle East, just as old state structures have been destroyed. But there is no, neither the Saudi nor the Emirati, and Türkiye is completely, you know, blocked from proceeding further than a few towns north of Aleppo. No regional country is given the ability, or those that have ability do not have the willpower for various reasons to initiate such a regional integration scheme, which could have resolved many issues, including the Israeli-Palestinian issue and many others. But we need to think about who is blocking that regional integration. And I don't think it's Türkiye. I think there are many other regional and global spoilers when it comes to regional integration and democratization. Thank you. I probably violated the time limit.
Because I mean, you had this question about this ideal situation with the Islamic movements and the armies, and I forgot to respond to this. I don't want you to think that I mean, chose not to respond. My point here is, of course, this is open to research. I think very interesting research, I would say. I mean, there are many different Islamic movements from Pakistan to Algeria to Sudan to here. And they, I think, have different relationships. They have had different relationships with the armies, armed forces. They suffered from them. They are still suppressed in some countries. Think about Muslim Brotherhood. I mean, how many decades they were suppressed. Jamaat Islami, but we also know that sometimes Islamic movements like armies. Like, I mean, they have to have them, like they like to have them on their side, right? But then it's not easy and it's not always good to have them. It's risky too. I don't know, the literature tells us that Muslim Brotherhood was in support of the 52 coup in Egypt, but then they suffered immediately from this under Nasser. And then for many decades, they did too. And then when Morsi came in, I think he chose his own killer, right? I mean, by himself, like because he thought maybe he would be by his side, right? I think the proper relationship, the ideal relationship, not to take any longer time, would be, I think, properly distanced professional relationship, not to, I mean, see them as an enemy, but at the same time, not to be so much fond of them. I think that would be, I mean, a wise decision.
Thank you very much.
There are 3 questions. All of them are very related with each other. Therefore, I would like to give one answer to these 3 questions. Turkey's relations with the West, namely United States and EU, is very unique when compared with the relations, Turkey's relations with other countries. Sami told me that can there be alternative? There are already alternatives, Astana process, Turkic Council, but the relations with the transatlantic countries are very unique. Why? Because these relations are not only security oriented, but they are built on the common values and norms, and they were built by institutions, on the institutions. I mean, the relations are institutionalized. When you become a part of the Western world, you automatically accept the norms and values, and you automatically become the part of these institutions, and they are binding. For example, EU, for example, European Council, for example, NATO, having a NATO identity. Therefore, it makes you just let me, I want to keep it very small, but let me give you one example from the Beri Buzan's example. Beri Buzan makes an analogy with the what is the civilization, what is the international society, and from Turkey's perspective, the Western world symbolizes civilization, and the patron of international society is the West, United States, European Union, and their partners. Beri Buzan says that the civilization is just imagine there are people socializing in a very warm room across the fire, and they are holding the wines, and they are drinking wines with each other. And this is the international society, but the walls are from the glasses, and there are some other people, they are very poor, and they see the socialized people with the cups, the glasses of wines in their hands from the outside, but they are very poor, and it is raining, and they are shivering. They are outside the international society. If you are a member of international society, you are in the warm room, but the walls of that room are from the glasses. If you throw a stone these glasses, you can destroy you can give harm to that room. Türkiye, since the beginning, I mean, since the proclamation of Turkish Republic, Türkiye wanted to be within that room, just by disregarding its Islamic identity or religious credentials. I don't know, I'm not that much sure to what extent I'm clear to you, but in my opinion, Turkey left some of its traditions, Islamic identity, just for the sake of being a part of that international, reliable partner of that international society, not system, society. Pardon? AK Party, in my opinion, made a challenge to this. And he said, there is not only one civilization symbolized by the West, there is an Islamic world civilization. And we originally belonged to that civilization. Let me give you an example from my grandpa. My grandpa fought against the enemy in Afyon, in the Aegean side, for the salvation of caliphate. Because my grandpa was a religious man, at the same time teaching at university, medrese, in Afyon. Afyon is a city, small city in the Aegean, together with Mustafa Kemal. But after understanding that Mustafa Kemal would proclaim a Turkish Republic secular, and his ultimate purpose, Mustafa Kemal's ultimate purpose, was not to the salvation of caliphate, my grandpa just withdrew and quitted being a ally of Mustafa Kemal, and he just wanted to save his life and lived in a small village, not stepping out from his house because he was under threat. Even this example may be explanatory to what extent, I mean, the Turkish Republic was founded, I mean, just abolishing the caliphates and the abolishing sultanates and the very deep, very radical revolutions, etc. All these were realized for the sake of being a part of the civilized world. Into war room, yes. But if you ask my personal view, Türkiye is not still in the warm room. Türkiye is not outside of that room, but it's in a corridor. Neither inside nor outside. European Union, huh? Knocking. European Union says, okay, just don't step in and just hold on. Yes, I will accept you, but you can be a privileged partnership and open-ended negotiations and etc. Turkey hoping. Under AK Party, they said, okay, we don't hope anymore. That's.
Thank you very much for our esteemed presenters. I would like to take you in a debate in the future to discuss the issues, because I think there is an explanation to a lot of the things you said, and there is also a path towards that, and it's a fascinating discussion, inshallah, that we will have in the future. I just want to remind everybody that tomorrow is our last and final day. In the morning, again, we're going to meet. Tomorrow is Sunday, March 19th, 10 o'clock. The theme is foreign policy and performance will continue. There will be a discussion on European Union policy under the AK Party rule, and by Dr. Irhan HNR from Istanbul Sabahattin Zaim University, and another presentation on foreign policy, on regional policies and the Muslim world, will be more towards the Muslim world, by Dr. Yasin Aktay from Ankara Yildirim Bayezid University, and finally on Turkey and the question of Palestine by Dr. Talha Kose from Ibn Khaldun University. And then the last session would be afternoon 2:30, titled Lessons Learned and Future Horizons by Dr. Burhan Kuruglu from Marmara University and Dr. Abdurrahman Babajan from Istanbul Medipol University. Thank you very much. And I hope to see you again. Take care. I think we got, but I want to give you okay. We have some books that will give you, right, one on civil military relations. Has a paper in that, which is